Hi, ever wonder what it's like to work another profession or live in the underworld? Listen to unsuspecting riders give a 10 to 15 minute personal masterclass as I spontaneously interview them as they enter my taxi. I'm your host, Simon Rushton, and this is Taxi Chronicles.
Yeah.
Okay, count us off.
Morning. Yes, we're back with another episode, another rider. Today we've got an interesting guy who's in the finance industry, and he's worked overseas in Hong Kong and Singapore, and he's going to tell us about his experience there of what it was like before and after 1997, and up to date, and his thoughts. So welcome, Bob. Nice to have you today.
Thanks very much. I think one thing that's quite interesting is the contrast between Hong Kong and Singapore. Most people think they're both Asian city-states, islands, both very profitable, very modern. For all of you who've ever seen the Hong Kong skyline or the Singapore skyline, they're amazing buildings, skyscrapers. But culturally, they are quite different. I think in the case of Hong Kong, it's a very, very entrepreneurial society, or it was. Very little light touch government, and basically people lived on their wits and developed businesses and worked hard and were successful. Singapore, on the other hand, was a contrast in the sense that there the government took a major role in developing the economic strength of the country after its partition from Malaysia. And there you saw a sort of top-down approach from the government, in which they planned the infrastructure of the country, they planned which economies were the best industries to be involved in. So they were, for example, in shipping, and then they moved into microprocessing for chips and things in the days when desktop computers were the main thing. And then they moved into digital as we moved more towards the digital age. So again, there it was, a very good government, very intelligent people who were planning forward the whole time. So that's quite a big change, difference between the two countries. And yet when you go there, you would say, oh, Singapore and Hong Kong look very much the same.
So both methods have worked then?
Very much so, yes. I think they have worked. I think inevitably in a sort of entrepreneurial society, there's more volatility. So there's been periods in Hong Kong where things have been booming, and then there's a bit of a crash. But it readjusts itself very quickly, whereas Singapore is perhaps a bit slower and a bit more planned.
Okay. So it's interesting. I didn't know Singapore was part of Malaysia, and you said they separated.
That's right, yes. Originally, Singapore and Malaysia joined as I think it's called the Confederation of Malay States. But then I think that there were just differences of opinion between Lee Kuan Yew, who was the founding sort of Prime Minister and founder of Singapore, and the Malaysians. And in the end, they broke away, probably a bit like Brexit, really.
So what... do you think that they've been better off for it being a separate?
I think so, because I think it's much easier. I think if you were part of Malaysia, then Singapore would have been the second state to Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia.
Okay.
Whereas by being independent, it was able to develop itself. It was able to bring in a lot of banking, financial services, and become, rather like Hong Kong, a sort of entrepreneur centre in its own right.
Which countries are strongest economically now?
I don't know the actual which is the highest GDP and things. I think they're very much on the par, to be honest with you. They do tend to sort of eye each other quite closely. There's a sort of slight rivalry, between, particularly for financial services, where you get, big banks, which one do they want to set up their regional headquarter in Hong Kong or Singapore? Okay. So there's a fair amount of competition between.
So it's a bit like France, England and Germany.
Very much, yeah, that's right. They all want to, to have the biggest slice of the cake, I think. I think the thing it's important is both of them were ex-British colonies, obviously, and therefore they both have a rule of law that is based on English law, and so common law, and I think businesses find it very helpful to have the sort of certainty you get with a very good legal system, in Asia, in emerging markets, and both of them have had very strong, legal systems that companies can rely on.
Okay. What was I going to say? So my mind's gone blank. I've got loads of questions because I'm finding this very fascinating. I'm actually learning here. What's I going to say now is, what was life like during the British occupation and then the change to the end of 1997? What was it like?
I think I went because my father lived there as well, and so I've been there since 1960. And there was a huge difference between the 60s, where it was still very much a colonial outpost, and when I worked there in business and things, which was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I think so that by the time I was working there was very little colonial influence, although when I was there before the handover, it was still a British colony. But in terms of doing business, in terms of the lifestyle, no different before or after, really. I think there are some trappings you get. There's the Hong Kong Cricket Club. There is a Singapore Cricket Club, which is a big thing. There's quite a lot of sport played by expatriates, but I think both of them as well have, because they're international centres for Asia, have got a lot of Americans, Europeans, Germans, French there as well. So they're both, what I describe them as, both very international cities.
Was your father in the finance industry as well?
No, my father was in the Hong Kong government, so was involved. But this was, he went out there in 1960 something and came back in about 1980, I think it was.
Okay. Do you, from what you saw of the living standard of the average local?
Yeah.
Has it improved during the colonial times, or has it drastically improved during after 1997, or has it gone down?
I think with Singapore, it's improved a lot under Singapore government. They've put a lot of work into housing, and they have a system there where you can almost buy your house on your pension. And so everyone, Singaporeans, will probably end up with some sort of property in sort of government finance blocks, really. Hong Kong, because it's more entrepreneurial, less government involvement, is a bit more laissez-faire, and there is, without question, a huge overcrowding problem in both cities, but particularly in Hong Kong. So accommodation is small. Flats there are very, very small compared to what you would live in say, England.
Even London.
Oh God, yeah.
Mind you, they're not that tall, are they? Are they tall? I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
I'm just thinking, as if I'm big. I'm 6'3", my family are real big.
Yeah,
so if you're small, it doesn't really.
I think what you get is that you get this family concept there, and so the family, the grandmother, the parents, the children will all live often in one property, and so it is crowded, and they get used to sharing bedrooms and things, which perhaps people here don't do so much of, but real estate prices are so high that that's what you end up with, is a flat of perhaps, I don't know, half the size of a small flat in London, probably.
Okay. Now, we've heard a lot about things on the news with Hong Kong and China and the new rules. Do you understand the rules? Do you want to explain that to us?
To be honest, I haven't been back in the last sort of 10 years, and really, that's been when you've had this sort of movement. There's always going to be a tension in Hong Kong between, it's a highly educated population there, and clearly, they want to say over their future. China is a very centrally planned country, and finds it difficult to accept an independence of thought from one of its territories, and I think the agreement in 1997 sort of gave this one country, two systems approach, but inevitably there's going to be tensions on that as people want more democracy, want more freedoms. And I think it's the way China manages that, and it's disappointing that they seemingly are sort of using new laws and things to crack down, and they can't see a way of perhaps gently relaxing, the freedoms and the political freedoms of people without jeopardizing the fact that it's a huge country, it's a very complex country to run, so you can't just let every province go off and do its own thing,
I was under the understanding that one nation, two parties,
one country, two systems.
One country, two systems. I was under the illusion that was working, because someone mentioned to me that when China took over Hong Kong, there was a maze with all these skyscrapers, and then they went back to Beijing and Shanghai and did all this major infrastructure to copy. But the only difference was the certain laws, but it was working. So it's kind of weird that they suddenly want to change things now.
I think it is. I mean, as I say, this is why it's difficult to comment, because when I was there, it was still very much the one country, two systems approach was working pretty well, I think if you remember, there were these protests with the umbrellas and things, and I think China got a bit spooked that Hong Kong was going to become almost like try and break away, a bit like as I was talking about Singapore and Malaysia, and it couldn't accept that, obviously, and I think it perhaps overreacted.
Okay, I suppose I've interviewed a lady from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
For like a Chinese heritage lady, and she says even though she's got family in China, when she goes there, it's like they're different people, and they don't talk politics because they have a different mindset about what they believe in the government, where she thinks, you could say on a Western scale, but she just thinks more out there, let's say.
Yes, and I think one thing you do notice between Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, was even when it was a British colony, the press were very free, and so people like my dad would be criticised in the papers if they thought they were doing a bad job, and you got therefore this acceptance of criticism, even though it was a colony and he wasn't elected to his position. So it was and I think a free press is quite difficult for China to deal with, because obviously in mainland China the press tends to push the party line and its control, whereas in Hong Kong it was a very independent press, and that continued after 97. But I think that's one of the areas of real tension for Hong Kong recently, which again is a shame, because it's a good way of letting pressure off. If you have a free press that can say the government's being an idiot, then it sort of relieves some of the internal pressure and tension.
It's funny because people always criticise China, but then I've interviewed people in the car, journalists, and they say if you knew the amount of is it red tape?
Yeah.
When it comes to being a journalist in England, and let's say there's a really good story or some fact, and it gets swept under the carpet because it's not the normal rhetoric. So I've spoken to quite a few people, and they feel like we're going down the same route of China, even though we're not meant to be in that boat, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think government. I mean, I think it's a lot different and worse in China. I think there's always a game of cat and mouse. I think in a Western democracy, that the government doesn't particularly want its mistakes to be aired and shown, and the press obviously want to do it, and so there is that sort of continual trying to hide things. But then you've also seen the government press have been pretty good at exposing scandals. I think the problem in China is that, and more totalitarian countries, that simply you use the police and you make up charges. Here, I think if a journalist got arrested and put on trial for trumped up charges, there would be a huge outcry, and the government would find it hard to fight it.
Did you hear what happened to the owner of Alibaba?
Jack Ma, yeah, he disappeared for a week or something.
Have they found him now?
Oh yeah, he's back again.
He's not talking about the government anymore.
I think he's being a bit quieter. Yes, again, these guys, these multi-billionaires in China, it's a challenge for the Chinese government to know how to deal with people like this who are international, who own international companies that are huge and very, very strong. Because again, they have independence, they are traveling the world. And again, the Chinese government would rather like them to be saying the same thing as the Chinese government, which they don't always do.
But in the same sense, they contribute. Jack Ma's the richest man in China, isn't he?
Yep.
So he contributes to their economy in a major way.
Yeah.
So can he be replaced? If is the question. And
I think when you've got 1 billion people, there was a saying of one of the old Chinese something that 1 million deaths is not a big thing in China. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was making the point that the country is so huge and so vast that nobody and no system or no thing is bigger than China as a whole. And I think that would apply to Jack Ma.
I think it does.
Yeah.
I think you're spot on there. I think he's got the message. Okay, I'm sorry. He's gonna walk around with one of those Chinese flags on his the button flags on his jacket from now on.
I think he. Yes.
Oh, I wouldn't want to be in his position, even for what all the tea in China they say. I wouldn't want to be in that position, not in a Chinese jail.
Well, I don't think he was in jail, to be fair. I think that he was just kept under house arrest. I think it was more to do with the fact he was trying to float a big financial service company, and he was criticising the Chinese banks and their rather old-fashioned ways of lending and things. So it wasn't so much Alibaba, it was the other one I think it was called Ant, was a company that caused...
Oh, but it's his company?
Yeah, it was one of the ones that was spun out of Alibaba that was then going to float on the Chinese stock market.
Okay. But then if that works, the Chinese government will benefit.
Yeah. As I say, everything in China is, they're very nervous of change. And, any change has to be very slow, very gradual, and make sure that nothing undermines the mission of China, and the Chinese Communist Party.
That's very interesting because, Apple, I was watching a documentary and it said Apple took 10 years before they opened up in China, shops, because they wanted to make sure they understood all the politics, the right people to know what not to do, what to do. And then they opened up, and the day they opened up, they sold out. The same day they opened up, a duplicate shop that wasn't Apple, but had all their logos and T-shirts and branding, opened up round the corner.
Yeah.
So after waiting 10 years, you're still losing out. You made money, but you're still losing out. So I was like, but I learned a lot from that though.
Yeah.
On business. Take your time. There's no rush. There's no rush at all.
Yes, it's an interesting question, isn't it? It's always the big tension between America and China is intellectual property and sort of stealing trade secrets. Yeah.
Because China doesn't have that policy at all, do they?
I think they're accepting that if they need, as they develop their own industries, they want protection as well. IP. So we'll see what happens in the long term. But yeah, there has been a tendency, I think, in the past to nick the good ideas.
There's a Chinese guy who went to, Arizona, one of those farming states, and he dug up seeds, and he got arrested later on for international sabotage or such and such, because he was trying to duplicate the farm agricultural seeds so they can use them in China.
Yeah.
And stuff. But he got caught because a local farmer saw him in the field and said, "What are you doing?" And he just ran off. They just drove off, kind of thing.
Really? Yeah. Well, there's always been stories of Chinese people working for the big digital companies, Apple or Google or Microsoft,
Yeah, I hear you. But it's been interesting talking to you.
Yeah, well, it's been good fun. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and I wish you well.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed the trip.
We hope you liked that interview. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to get the latest daily episode. Ever considered investing in the continent with the fastest growing economy and population on Earth? The same continent that holds 30% of the world's known natural resources? Then listen to our sister podcast, Africa Investor Stories, where you will hear real investors with real stories from around the world share their experience of investing in Africa. We post Monday and Thursday at 10 a.m.